Young schoolteacher fed a starving drifter. Not knowing he was the governor's missing son, she opened her door to feed a starving stranger. Not knowing she was about to save the man the entire territory had been searching for 3 years. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves and distant snow when Emma Whitmore heard the scraping sound against her schoolhouse door. At first, she thought it might be a branch blown loose from the old cottonwood, or perhaps a stray dog seeking shelter from the Colorado cold. But when she peered through the small window, her breath caught in her throat. A man sat slumped against the wooden steps, his back pressed to the door frame like he'd used the last of his strength just to reach this far. His clothes hung on him like burial shrouds, fabric so worn it seemed held together by dust and desperation alone. His hat had fallen beside him, revealing hair the color of winter wheat, matted and long enough to brush his shoulders. But it was his face that made Emma's heart clench, gaunt as a skull, with cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass and eyes that stared at nothing with the hollow emptiness of a man who'd forgotten his own name. She should have been afraid. A woman alone on the frontier learned caution like she learned to breathe. But something in his stillness spoke of surrender rather than threat, of a soul so depleted it couldn't summon the energy for harm, even if it wanted to. Emma opened the door slowly, and the man's head lifted with effort that seemed to cost him dearly. His eyes, pale blue like winter sky, met hers for just a moment before falling away in shame. "Ma'am," he whispered, his voice cracked like drought-dried earth. I'm sorry to trouble you. I was just—" He tried to rise, his hands shaking as they pressed against the doorframe. But his legs betrayed him, and he sank back down. "Just resting a spell. When did you last eat?" The words left Emma's lips before her cautious mind could stop them. He blinked up at her, confusion flickering across his features as if the concept of food had become foreign to him. Tuesday, maybe?" Or, his brow furrowed. "What day is it now?" "Friday." Emma stepped back, holding the door wider. "Come inside." "Ma'am, I don't want to. I wasn't asking." There was steel beneath the kindness in her voice, the same tone she used when her students tried to skip their lessons. "You'll collapse if you sit there much longer. And I won't have that on my conscience." It took him 3 attempts to stand, each one a testament to stubborn while fighting against a body that had been pushed beyond its limits. Emma wanted to help him, but something in his careful movements warned her that her touch might shatter whatever fragile dignity he had left. He followed her inside, like a ghost learning to walk among the living again. The schoolhouse was small but warm, heated by a pot-bellied stove that cast dancing shadows across the wooden desks where her students learned their letters each morning. Her living quarters occupied the back half of the building, a simple arrangement with a narrow bed, a small table, and shelves lined with books that had traveled with her from Pennsylvania. "Sit," she said, pulling out the single chair by her table. He lowered himself into it with the careful movements of someone whose bones had learned the language of pain. Emma moved to her small kitchen area, her hands already reaching for the pot of stew she'd made that morning. It wasn't much: potatoes, carrots, and a few precious pieces of beef, but it was warm and filling. She ladled a generous portion into a bowl, added a thick slice of bread, and set it before him. The stranger stared at the meal as if it were a miracle. His hands trembled as he picked up the spoon, and for a moment Emma thought he might weep. Instead, he closed his eyes and took a slow, deliberate breath. "Thank you," he said, and those 2 words carried more weight than 1,000 speeches. He ate slowly, deliberately, like a man who had learned that rushed meals could make a starving stomach rebel. Emma busied herself tidying the already spotless schoolroom, giving him privacy for what felt like a sacred act. But she watched from the corner of her eye, noting how he savored each bite, how he broke the bread into small pieces and made them last. "I can work," he said suddenly, his voice stronger now that food had begun to restore him. "I'm handy with repairs, good with animals. I can pay you back." "What's your name?" Emma asked, settling into the chair across from him. Something flickered behind his eyes, fear maybe, or pain so deep it had carved permanent shadows. "Sam." he said after a moment. Just some. She nodded, accepting the half-truth with the same grace she'd accepted his presence at her door. Everyone on the frontier carried secrets like they carried water, carefully, because you never knew when you'd need what little you had. Well, Sam, she said, I could use help with the winter preparations. The roof has some loose shingles, and my garden needs clearing before the first hard freeze. He nodded eagerly, some light returning to those winter sky eyes. Yes, ma'am. Whatever you need. As he finished the last of his meal, Emma found herself studying his profile in the lamplight. There was something about him that didn't quite fit. The way he held his spoon, the careful pronunciation of his words despite their drawled delivery, the soft look of his hands beneath the dirt and calluses. But broken men came in all shapes on the frontier, carrying stories too heavy for their shoulders and secrets too dark for daylight. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both how fragile the barrier was between warmth and cold, between salvation and loss. Sam's eyes drifted to the sound, and for just a moment, Emma glimpsed something haunted in his expression, the look of a man who'd been running so long he'd forgotten what he was running toward. She wondered what ghosts chased him through the Colorado nights, and why a simple bowl of stew had made him look at her like she'd handed him back his soul. She taught the nameless drifter to read again, watching his fingers trace letters like a man relearning to pray, but his educated voice kept slipping through the careful drawl he wore like armor. The days fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Sam worked from sunrise to sunset, his hands growing steadier with each passing hour as Emma's cooking put flesh back on his bones and purpose back in his movements. He mended the schoolhouse roof with the focused intensity of a man grateful for honest work, each nail driven home like a small prayer of thanks. Emma watched him from her classroom window as October painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. There was something almost desperate in the way he threw himself into every task, as if staying busy could keep whatever demons chased him at bay. When he thought no one was looking, she caught glimpses of a different man entirely. The way he paused to study the grain of wood before cutting it, the gentle care he showed when coaxing her stubborn, well-pumped back to life, the unconscious grace in his movements that spoke of a life once lived far from manual labor. "You've done this before," she said one afternoon, finding him in her small garden behind schoolhouse. He'd spent the morning clearing away the spent tomato vines and preparing the soil for winter, working with a knowledge that came from somewhere deeper than desperation. Sam's hands stilled on the hoe handle. "Done what, ma'am?" "Gardening. The way you test the soil, how you know which plants to pull and which to leave for seed." Emma knelt beside him, her skirts spreading in the dirt as she helped gather the last of the winter squash. Most drifters I've known couldn't tell a weed from a watermelon. A shadow passed across his face, quick as a cloud over the sun. Someone I knew once had a garden. I helped out some. The careful way he avoided saying mother or wife told Emma more than his words ever could. Everyone on the frontier had learned to speak in half-truths, to bury the pieces of themselves that hurt too much to carry in daylight. She let the silence stretch between them, comfortable and undemanding. That evening, as had become their custom, they shared supper at her small table. Emma had made cornbread and beans, simple fare that had sustained frontier families for generations. Sam ate slowly, savoring each bite as if he still couldn't quite believe there would be another meal tomorrow. "I've been thinking," Emma said, pouring coffee into their tin cups. "Winter's coming fast, and the children will need extra help with their reading once the weather keeps them inside more. Would you mind sitting in on lessons sometimes? Another pair of hands would be useful." Sam nearly choked on his coffee. "Ma'am, I'm not. You can read, can't you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the oil lamp. Sam's fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup, and Emma noticed again how soft his hands looked despite their recent calluses, how carefully he'd folded his napkin beside his plate. "It's been a while," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like riding a horse," Emma said gently. "Some things you never really forget." The next morning, she found him standing before her bookshelf, his fingers hovering over the spine of a worn copy of Walt Whitman's poetry. He pulled his hand back as if the books might burn him. "Go ahead," Emma encouraged, sorting through her lesson plans at the table. "Take whichever one speaks to you." Sam's hand trembled as he pulled the Whitman from the shelf, opening it with the reverence most men reserved for scripture. His lips moved silently as he read, and Emma pretended not to notice the tears that gathered in the corners of his eyes. "I celebrate myself and sing myself," he whispered, the words falling from his lips with a familiarity that made Emma's breath catch. "And what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you." The accent was gone. The careful frontier drawl had vanished entirely, replaced by the cultured tones of someone who'd been educated far beyond the reach of prairie schoolhouses. Emma kept her eyes fixed on her papers, but her heart began to race. "Beautiful words," she said carefully. Sam snapped the book shut, the mask sliding back over his features like clouds covering the moon. "Yeah," he said, the drawl thick again. "Real pretty, but the damage was done." That afternoon, as her students struggled through their McGuffey readers, Emma found herself studying Sam where he sat mending harness in the corner. The way he unconsciously corrected little Mary Peterson's pronunciation. How he straightened when she discussed the principles of democracy during their civics lesson. The flash of engagement in his eyes when she mentioned the territorial capital, quickly suppressed but unmistakably there. When the children left for the day, chattering like sparrows as they scattered toward home, Emma approached him with a worn primer in her hands. "I thought you might want to practice," she said simply, "just to brush off the rust." Sam stared at the book as if it were a rattlesnake. "Emma, just between us," she said, settling beside him on the bench. "No judgment, no questions. Just remembering." His fingers closed around the primer with infinite care. They sat together in the golden light of late afternoon, Emma's gentle voice guiding him through passages that should have been child's play but felt monumental to a man trying to reclaim pieces of himself he'd deliberately buried. The boy ran to the store. He read haltingly, his educated pronunciation fighting against his assumed drawl. He bought bread for his mother. "Good," Emma said softly. "Now this one." The father worked hard to provide for his family. He loved them more than his own life. Sam's voice broke on the last words, and the primer fell from his shaking hands. Emma made no move to comfort him, sensing that her touch might shatter whatever fragile composure he was fighting to maintain. Instead, she simply sat beside him in the growing dusk, two souls sharing the weight of words too heavy for the evening air. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwood leaves, carrying the promise of winter and the scent of secrets that couldn't stay buried forever. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the sound lonely and wild and full of longing for something just beyond reach. Sam picked up the primer again, his voice steady now, but soft as prayer. Home is where the heart learns to heal. Emma wondered whose heart he was thinking of, and why the simple act of reading seemed to be breaking his in two. The marshal's faded photograph made Emma's blood turn to ice, because the missing governor's son she'd been hearing about for 3 years was sitting at her kitchen table, calling himself Sam. The territorial marshal arrived on a Tuesday morning when the first snow dusted the mountains like powdered sugar. Emma heard the hoofbeats before she saw the rider, that steady clip-clop that spoke of official business and unwelcome news. Through her classroom window, she watched Marshal William Crawford dismount his bay, gelding with the careful movements of a man whose joints had logged too many hard miles in the saddle. She knew Crawford by reputation, a fair man who'd kept the peace in 3 counties for over a decade, honest as daylight and twice as relentless when he caught scent of his quarry. The silver star on his vest caught the morning sun as he tied his horse to the hitching post, and Emma's stomach clenched with a dread she couldn't name. Sam was behind the schoolhouse, splitting wood for the coming winter. The steady thunk of his axe had become as familiar as her own heartbeat over the past month. She could picture him there, sleeves rolled up despite the cold, his movements efficient and sure, sweat beading on his brow despite the October chill. He'd grown stronger under her care. The hollow-eyed scarecrow who'd collapsed on her doorstep transformed into something approaching the man he was meant to be. Miss Whitmore. Crawford's voice carried the authority of his badge and the weariness of his years. Might I have a word? Emma stepped outside, pulling her shawl tight against the mountain air. Of course, Marshal. What brings you out this way? Crawford reached into his coat and withdrew a photograph, its edges worn soft from handling. I'm looking for this man. Goes by the name Samuel Harrison. Been missing for near 3 years now. The world tilted sideways. Emma stared at the photograph. A formal portrait of a young man in expensive clothes, his hair neatly trimmed, his eyes bright with the confidence of someone who'd never known real hunger or desperation. But the bone structure was unmistakable, the line of his jaw, the winter-pale eyes that had looked at her with such desperate gratitude that first night. His father's the territorial governor, Crawford continued, watching Emma's face with the careful attention of a man whose life depended on reading people correctly. Went missing after some scandal back in Denver. Family's been looking for him ever since, offering a substantial reward for information leading to his return. Emma's mouth went dry as desert sand. Behind the schoolhouse, the steady rhythm of the axe never faltered, each blow driving home the terrible truth she'd been too blind to see. The educated accent that slipped through his careful drawl. The way he held the book like it was a beloved friend. The knowledge of gardens and literature and things no drifter should know. Substantial how? She heard herself ask, hating the words even as they left her lips. $500, Crawford said quietly. Dead or alive? Though the governor's hoping for alive, naturally. $500. More money than Emma would see in 5 years of teaching. Enough to buy land of her own, to start the school she'd always dreamed of, to secure a future that didn't depend on the charity of frontier towns and their fickle school boards. May I? She reached for the photograph with hands that barely trembled, studying the face she knew so well yet had never truly seen. What kind of scandal? Crawford shifted his weight, his leather gun belt creaking in the silence. The kind that ruins political careers and breaks families apart. Young Samuel there got himself mixed up with some unfortunate associates, made choices that reflected poorly on his father's position. Nothing criminal, you understand, but enough to make the governor's enemies smell blood in the water. The axe fell silent. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs as footsteps approached through the fallen leaves. Sam appeared around the corner of the schoolhouse, his shirt damp with sweat, with chips clinging to his rolled-up sleeves. He took in the scene with those pale eyes, Emma holding the photograph, the Marshall star glinting in the morning sun, the tension thick as smoke between them. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Sam's face went white as fresh snow, and Emma watched 3 years of careful construction crumble like a house of cards in a windstorm. Hello, Samuel, Crawford said gently, his hand resting easy on his gun, but not threatening. Yet, your father's been worried sick about you. Sam's throat worked soundlessly, his eyes darting between Emma's face and the photograph in her hands. She saw the moment he realized his sanctuary was gone, that the identity he'd built with calloused hands and borrowed humility was as fragile as morning frost. I'm not, he started, then stopped, his shoulders sagging in defeat. How long have you known? About 5 minutes, Emma said softly, her voice barely carrying over the wind that rustled through the cottonwood leaves like whispered accusations. And you, Marshall? Crawford studied him with the patient gaze of a man who'd spent years learning to separate truth from lies. Been tracking rumors and false leads for 3 years, son. Got word last week that a well-spoken drifter was seen in these parts, helping out the local schoolteacher. Figured it was worth the ride to check. Sam laughed, a sound like breaking glass. 3 years. I made it 3 years. And it's kindness that catches me in the end. His eyes found Emma's, and she saw in them a pain so deep it seemed to echo from his bones. I never meant for you to get tangled up in this, Emma. I swear on my mother's grave, I never meant Your mother's not dead, Crawford interrupted. She sends her love, along with your father's promise that all's forgiven if you'll just come home. Home. Sam spoke the word like it tasted of ashes. You think I ran because of the scandal? Because I couldn't face the shame of disappointing dear old Dad. He shook his head, his laugh bitter as medicine. Marshall, you don't know the half of it. Emma found her voice at last, though it came out smaller than she intended. Then tell us. Tell us why a governor's son ends up half dead on a schoolteacher's doorstep, calling himself by half a name and running from everything he used to be. Sam's eyes met hers across the space that suddenly felt wide as a canyon. In them, she read the whole story. A young man crushed under expectations he never chose, a life mapped out in political ambitions and social obligations that felt more like shackles than blessings. A soul that had chosen freedom over comfort, even when freedom meant hunger and loneliness and the constant fear of discovery. Because, he said quietly, sometimes running away is the only way to find out who you really are. The marshal's horse stamped and snorted, impatient with standing still. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley, carrying its own cargo of dreams and disappointments toward destinations unknown. Emma looked down at the photograph in her hands, the confident young man with his pressed clothes and easy smile, then up at the Sam she knew, weathered and humbled and real in ways the boy in the picture had never been allowed to be. The choice stretched before them all like a fork in a mountain trail. And Emma realized that whatever happened next would change everything they thought they knew about duty, love, and the price of coming home. The marshal waited with his warrant. The governor's telegrams piled like fallen leaves. But sometimes the longest journey home begins with finding the courage to choose who you want to become. Dawn came slowly to the Colorado mountains, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold, while shadows still pooled in the valleys like spilled ink. Emma stood at her kitchen window, watching Sam load the last of his few belongings into Marshall Crawford saddlebags. 3 days had passed since the world had tilted on its axis. 3 days of telegrams from Denver and hushed conversations that stretched long into the night. The reward money sat on her table in crisp bills, $500 that felt heavier than gold in her hands. Crawford had insisted she take it, said her information had been vital to closing the case. But the money felt like betrayal, like 30 pieces of silver that burned her fingers every time she touched it. You could have run again, she said as Sam approached the steps where their story had begun. His face was clean-shaven now, his hair trimmed short by Crawford's steady hand. And in the morning light, she could see glimpses of the man in the photograph, the governor's son with his refined bones and educated bearing. Where would I go? Sam's voice carried a weariness that had nothing to do with the early hour. He'd find me eventually. They always do. He paused, his hand resting on the porch rail he'd mended just last week. Besides, I'm tired of running from ghosts that live inside my own skin. Marshall Crawford emerged from the schoolhouse, his face grave, but not unkind. Over the past 3 days, Emma had watched him listen to Sam's story with the patience of a confessor. The suffocating expectations, the political schemes that treated a young man's life like a chess piece, the scandal that had been the final straw in a relationship built more on ambition than affection. The horses are ready, Crawford said quietly. Your father's train arrives in Denver tomorrow evening. He's eager to see you, Samuel. I'm sure he is. Sam's laugh held no humor. 3 years is a long time to have your heir missing when there's an election coming up. Emma watched something pass between the two men, an understanding born of Crawford's years reading the hearts of desperate people. The marshal had seen enough runaway sons to know the difference between rebellion and survival, enough broken families to recognize when forgiveness might come too late. For what it's worth, Crawford said, adjusting his hat against the morning sun, your father's changed since you've been gone. Lost weight, lost some of that fire that used to burn so bright. Man gets older. Maybe he starts to understand what matters more, power or family. Sam nodded, but didn't reply. He turned back to Emma, and in his winter-pale eyes she saw the reflection of everything they'd shared. Quiet evenings over simple meals, the gentle patience of teaching him to read again, the growing trust that had bloomed between two wounded souls learning to heal. "I want you to keep the money," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before her careful teacher's composure could stop them. "Emma, no, listen to me." She stepped closer, close enough to smell the soap he'd used and see the small scar above his left eyebrow that she'd never noticed before. "You'll need it, not for comfort or luxury, but for freedom. Real freedom, not the kind that comes from running away, but the kind that comes from having choices." Sam reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper, pressing it into her hands. "I wrote this last night. It's a letter to the Territorial Education Board, recommending you for the position of Regional Superintendent. Sign with my real name and title." His smile was crooked, but genuine. Turns out being the governor's son opened some doors, even for a prodigal. Emma unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the formal script that praised her dedication, her innovative teaching methods, her ability to see potential in the most unlikely students. It was a door to everything she dreamed of: respect, security, the chance to shape education policy across the territory. "I can't accept this," she whispered. "You already have." Sam's hand covered hers, warm and rough from weeks of honest labor. "You saved my life, Emma. Not just from starvation, but from becoming a ghost haunting my own existence. Let me return the favor." Crawford cleared his throat gently. "Sun's getting high. We need to make the noon train in Colorado Springs if we're going to reach Denver on schedule." The moment of parting stretched between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross. Emma had lost people before: her parents to fever, her sister to childbirth, students to the harsh realities of frontier life. But this felt different, like watching someone choose to walk back into a fire they'd barely escaped the first time. "Will you write?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "If you want me to." "Edo." Sam nodded, then surprised her by taking her hands in both of his. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing a man instead of a ghost. For teaching me that kindness isn't weakness, and that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let someone help you." He mounted Crawford's spare horse with the easy grace of someone born to privilege but tempered by hardship. In the saddle, he looked like what he'd always been: a gentleman playing at being a common man, a role he'd worn so well that Emma had almost forgotten it was a costume. "Samuel," she called as they prepared to ride away. "Remember what you learned here. Remember that the man who chopped my firewood and mended my roof, he's real too. Don't let them bury him in silk and politics." His smile was the first truly happy expression she'd seen on his face since Crawford had shown her that damning photograph. "I won't," he promised. "How about a good teacher?" Emma watched them ride east toward the railroad and the world of telegrams and expectations that waited beyond the mountains. The autumn wind carried the sound of their horses' hooves long after they'd disappeared around the bend, and she found herself standing alone in the schoolyard where children's laughter usually filled the air. Inside, the schoolhouse felt enormous and empty. She moved through the familiar routines, arranging papers, preparing lessons, stoking the fire against the morning chill, but everything seemed hollow without the quiet presence of the man who'd called himself Sam. That evening, she sat at her small table and opened the territorial newspaper Crawford had left behind. On the third page, buried between advertisements for patent medicines and notices of land sales, she found a small item. Governor Harrison announces the safe return of his son Samuel, missing for 3 years. The young Harrison is expected to take an active role in his father's upcoming re-election campaign. Emma folded the paper carefully and set it aside. Outside her window, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. And somewhere to the east, a train carried a reformed prodigal home to face whatever redemption or reckoning awaited him. She picked up her pen and began to write, not a letter, but a lesson plan for tomorrow's class. At the top of the page, she wrote, "Today we will learn about the different kinds of courage." The money Crawford had given her still sat untouched on the table. But beside it now lay something far more valuable, a letter of recommendation that could change her life, written in the careful script of a man who'd learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the chance to become who they're meant to be. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, wild and free and unashamed of its nature. Emma smiled and continued writing, planning lessons for children who would grow up to make their own choices about who they wanted to become and what price they were willing to pay for the privilege of being truly free.